The first thing she said to me wasn't welcome, or even have a seat. It was, "We're terminating your position effective immediately. No hesitation, no eye contact, just a rehearsed sentence delivered like she was reading off a teleprompter she barely understood." Her name was Vanessa Hale, the CEO's daughter-in-law, freshly appointed Chief Strategy Officer at Halcyon Dynamics, a company I had spent 2 decades quietly building from its legal skeleton upward. She was sitting in my office, my chair, my desk. My nameplate had already been removed, day one for her. Final day for me, apparently. But before I tell you what I did right after walking out of that room, and how it made the entire board panic go ahead and hit the like button, trust me, this story is just getting started. I'm also curious, where are you watching from? What's the weather like there right now? I always enjoy knowing who's on the other side of the screen. Now, let's go back to that room. A junior HR associate stood behind her, pale and rigid, clutching a tablet like it might shield him from what was happening. He looked like he wanted to disappear. I almost felt bad for him. Vanessa didn't look nervous. She looked proud, like this was her moment. No explanation, no documentation, no board approval, just a single, careless decision dressed up as authority. I studied her for a second. The polished confidence, the expensive suit that still had crease lines from the packaging, the kind of confidence you get when power is handed to you, not earned. "I assume there's a reason," I asked calmly. She smiled tight. "Dismissive. We're restructuring leadership. You're no longer aligned with the company's direction." Aligned. I almost laughed. Instead, I stood up slowly, smoothing out my jacket. No anger, no argument. Just composure, the kind you develop when you've watched people mistake titles for control one too many times. I placed my badge on the desk between us. "If we're doing this," I said quietly, "let's do it properly." She raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested. "Tell your father-in-law," I added, "that the board meeting in 3 hours is going to be very interesting." That was the first time she hesitated. Just a flicker. Then it was gone. Security was already waiting outside when I walked out of the office. The hallway felt different, quieter, like the building itself knew something she didn't. They thought they had just removed me. What they didn't realize was that they had just triggered me. I just want to note that this story is fictional, enhanced with the help of AI to make it more vivid and emotionally engaging. I believe you'll clearly feel the deeper, valuable lessons it carries. Now, let's continue. I didn't argue. That's what unsettled her the most. People like Vanessa expect resistance. They expect raised voices, desperate explanations, maybe even a little humiliation they can dress up as decisive leadership. It makes them feel powerful. It gives their actions weight. But I gave her none of that. I simply stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the room uncomfortable. The HR associate shifted his weight behind her. Vanessa tapped her pen against the desk, impatient, like she had already moved on to her next strategic decision. I reached for my badge. It had been clipped to my jacket the same way it had been every morning for years. A small, insignificant object to anyone else. To me, it was a symbol of access, of systems, of quiet authority that never needed announcing. I unclipped it slowly and placed it on the desk. Not dropped, not tossed, placed right in front of her. "You'll want to document this properly," I said, my voice calm, almost helpful. She frowned slightly. "HR has it handled." I glanced at the young associate behind her. He avoided my eyes. Of course he didn't. Vanessa leaned back in the chair, crossing her arms. "Security will escort you out." I nodded once. No resistance, no hesitation. But I didn't move right away. Instead, I adjusted the sleeve of my jacket, smoothing out a wrinkle that didn't exist. A habit. A pause. A moment to let her sit in what she thought was control. Then I looked at her. Really looked this time, at the confidence that hadn't been tested, at the authority that had never been challenged, at someone who believed a title could replace understanding. "I want to make sure we do this correctly," I said. She sighed, clearly annoyed now. "It's already done." "No," I replied quietly. "It's just started." That caught her off guard, just enough for her to stop tapping the pen. I let that silence linger for half a second before adding, "You might want to inform your father-in-law." Her expression tightened. "Excuse me, the board meeting," I continued, as if I were reminding her of something routine. "In 3 hours. He should probably be there in person, for the first time since I walked in." She hesitated. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I did, because I've spent years watching people realize, too late, that they misunderstood the situation they were in. "This has nothing to do with the board," she said. A little too quickly, I gave a small, almost polite smile. "Everything does." Then I turned and walked toward the door. No dramatic exit, no final speech, just steady steps across the office I had occupied long before she knew it existed. The HR associate stepped aside immediately, practically flattening himself against the wall to give me space. His eyes followed me like he wanted to ask something, but didn't dare. Vanessa said nothing. Behind me, the room felt smaller, tighter, like the air had shifted in a way she couldn't explain. When I opened the door, the security guard was already there. He looked at me, then at the badge on the desk, then back at me again. Confusion written all over his face. "Ma'am," he said carefully. "It's fine," I replied. I stepped out into the hallway without looking back. The doors closed behind me with a soft click. Inside that room, she still believed she had just made her first powerful decision. Outside, I was already counting down the minutes. By the time I reached the elevator, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. Not because I was reacting, because I had been preparing for this moment long before Vanessa Hale ever stepped into that office. The lobby doors slid open with their usual quiet precision. The receptionist glanced up at me, surprised to see me leaving so early, but she didn't say a word. No one ever questioned quiet exits. That's the thing about real power. It doesn't announce itself when it moves. It simply acts, outside. The air felt sharper, clearer, like stepping out of a room where someone had been slowly draining the oxygen without anyone noticing. I didn't rush. I crossed the street, entered a small cafe on the corner, and took the table by the window. The same table I'd used dozens of times before. Not for coffee, for control. I opened my laptop. Within seconds, I was inside the system most people at Halcyon Dynamics didn't even know existed. Not the polished dashboards the executives like to show off in quarterly meetings. Not the sanitized reports that filtered risk into digestible summaries. The real system, the backbone, the one tied directly to the shareholder registry, legal filings, and governance protocols. And buried inside that system was something very few people had ever read in full. Clause 17C, a simple label for something that was anything but simple. I pulled up the original document, the one I had drafted myself nearly 17 years ago, back when the company was still fragile enough to collapse under the weight of a single bad decision, back when I realized that ambition without structure was a liability. Clause 17C was never meant to be used often. In fact, it was designed so that it would almost never need to be used at all. It was a safeguard, a contingency, a legal tripwire waiting for someone reckless enough to trigger it. The wording was precise. If an executive without equity initiated the termination of a corporate officer without a formal board vote, all interim authority granted to that executive would be immediately suspended. Executive control would revert to the majority shareholder pending an emergency board review. No exceptions, no reversals, no quiet fixes behind closed doors. I scrolled through the page slowly, rereading every line. Not because I needed to, but because I respected the weight of it. Vanessa had no equity. Her position had not been ratified by the board, and she had just signed a termination order. Alone. I leaned back slightly, letting that settle into something almost resembling satisfaction. Not revenge, not anger, just inevitability. People like Vanessa believe power comes from proximity, from family ties, from titles handed to them before they understand what those titles actually mean. They never consider the systems beneath them, the clauses, the agreements, the quiet frameworks built by people who never needed recognition to maintain control. I returned to the screen and began assembling the activation file. Every document was already prepared. Timestamp templates, shareholder breakdowns, legal references. All I had to do was finalize the trigger. I attached her termination memo, the one she had signed so confidently. That was the key. Without it, Clause 17C was just ink on paper. With it, it became something else entirely, a mechanism, a shift, a reset. I added the final signature, encrypted the file, and queued the distribution list, board members, lead investors, general counsel, external legal oversight, every person who needed to know, every person who would understand exactly what had just happened. My finger hovered over the send command for a brief second. Not hesitation, recognition, because once this was activated, there would be no going back for anyone involved. Not for Vanessa, not for the founder, not even for the board. I pressed send. The system confirmed delivery within seconds. Sealed, logged, distributed. Clause 17C was now active. I closed the laptop and looked out the window, watching the reflection of the city move across the glass. Somewhere, 3 floors above where I used to sit. Vanessa was probably still settling into her new office, adjusting her chair, drafting announcements, believing she had just made a bold leadership decision. She had no idea she had just stepped on something that had been waiting years to be triggered. And now, the clock had started. 3 hours. That was all the board had before they were legally required to respond. 3 hours before titles would mean nothing. 3 hours before control returned to where it had always been. The moment the file left my outbox, the structure of halcyon dynamics began to shift. Not visibly, not immediately, but fundamentally. Most people think power changes hands with announcements, signatures, or public statements. They imagine dramatic moments, boardroom confrontations, headlines. That's not how real control works. Real control moves in silence. It moves through documents, timestamps, and obligations that cannot be ignored. Within minutes, the first confirmations came in: secure receipt logs, board assistants acknowledging delivery, legal departments flagging priority review. Each notification was small, routine on its own. Together, they formed something irreversible. I didn't need to call anyone. I didn't need to explain. The clause explained everything. Clause 17. C didn't just notify the board. It compelled them. It forced their attention, their presence, their compliance. Once activated, it triggered an automatic requirement, an emergency meeting within the same day. No delays, no rescheduling, and more importantly, it stripped away something Vanessa didn't even realize she was standing on: authority, back at headquarters. Her access was already being questioned, not revoked, not yet, but flagged. Her credentials, her approvals, her executive permissions were no longer absolute. Systems that once responded instantly were beginning to hesitate, to verify, to cross-check. Because the moment Clause 17C went live, her authority became conditional, mine. On the other hand, did not. It reverted. That was the beauty of it. I didn't gain power. I reclaimed it. I opened my phone and checked the internal registry one more time. There it was. Exactly where it had always been. Quietly recorded and rarely discussed. Majority shareholder, Juliet Carter equity stake, 72.04% voting control active. No titles, no spotlight, just ownership. The kind that doesn't disappear when someone decides to play executive. I imagined Vanessa in that office, scrolling through dashboards that were slowly turning against her, numbers she couldn't access, approvals that wouldn't go through. systems that no longer recognized her as final authority. Confusion always comes before panic. And panic was coming. The board members would be opening their packets now, thick, detailed, impossible to ignore. Every page reinforcing the same reality: a non-equity appointee had initiated an unauthorized termination. That alone was enough. But the supporting documents made it airtight. Her signed memo, the timestamp, the absence of a board vote, all of it lined up perfectly, legally. There was no interpretation, no gray area. She had triggered the clause herself. I took a slow sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and allowed myself a moment of stillness. Not satisfaction, precision. Everything was unfolding exactly as it was designed to. Across the city, phones would be ringing, assistants scrambling, legal teams rereading documents they hadn't touched in years, investors asking questions no one wanted to answer. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the founder would receive the call, the one that starts with confusion and ends with realization. Because he would understand something his daughter-in-law did not. That this wasn't a personnel decision. This was a structural event. A legal reversion of control. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. I stood up from the table and closed my laptop again. There was nothing left to do from here. The system was already moving, and it didn't require my presence to continue. That was the point of building it this way. No reliance on personalities, no dependence on appearances, just rules, enforced exactly as written. I stepped outside once more. The city carrying on as if nothing had changed, but inside Halcyon Dynamics, everything had. The illusion of power had been removed. And in its place, something far less forgiving had taken over. Reality. People always assume they know who holds power in a company. They look at titles, corner offices, press releases, family names printed in bold across glossy annual reports. They never look at the contracts, they never look at the percentages, and they certainly never look at the person who chose not to be seen. Halcyon Dynamics didn't start as the company Vanessa thought she had just inherited. It began in a cramped office with mismatched chairs, unpaid invoices, and a founder who believed vision alone could carry a business forward. Daniel Hale was brilliant in the way many founders are. He could sell an idea, inspire a room, convince investors to take risks they barely understood. But he had no structure, no safeguards, no discipline. That's where I came in. I wasn't brought in to lead. I wasn't even brought in to be visible. I was hired to fix things that didn't make headlines. Compliance gaps, contract inconsistencies, risk exposure buried in documents no one had time to read. I built the foundation, quietly, system by system, clause by clause, agreement by agreement, while Daniel was out pitching growth. I was inside making sure the company could survive it. At some point, he offered me a title, Vice President of Operations. It sounded impressive. It looked good on paper. I declined. Instead, I asked for equity. He laughed at the time, said something about how most people wanted recognition, not percentages. I told him I preferred ownership. That was the first piece. It didn't stop there. Every deal, every negotiation, every crisis the company faced, I made the same request. Not bonuses, not promotions. Equity. Small amounts at first. 0.5% here, 1% there. Nothing that drew attention. Nothing that threatened anyone's perception of control. But over time, those pieces added up. When the company hit its third year and needed emergency restructuring, I negotiated more shares in exchange for stabilizing their financial exposure. When the original CFO walked out during a dispute over mismanaged funds, I absorbed part of his stake quietly. When a legal conflict with one of Daniel's relatives nearly tore the company apart, I handled the settlement. In return, I took equity instead of cash. Every time the company faced pressure, I took responsibility, and I took shares. No announcements, no celebration, just signatures. By the time Halcyon Dynamics became a recognizable name, the distribution of ownership had already changed in ways most people didn't bother to track. Daniel still had influence. He still had presence. But control had shifted. Gradually, legally, permanently. I remember the exact moment it crossed a threshold. Year 8. I reviewed the cap table late one evening. Just like any other routine check. Except it wasn't routine anymore. 41%. That's where I stood then. Not a majority. Not yet. But enough to matter. Enough to influence decisions in ways that didn't require permission. From there, the final pieces came faster than anyone realized. A failed partnership. A buyout opportunity. A quiet acquisition of shares from investors who wanted out. Each transaction carefully structured. Each percentage added without noise. Until eventually, there was nothing left to negotiate. 72%. Majority ownership, complete voting control, filed, verified, and recorded in the registry like any other corporate fact. No headlines, no recognition, just reality. And embedded within that ownership was everything I had built to protect it, including Clause 17C. It wasn't an afterthought. It was intentional. A safeguard designed specifically for moments like this, for situations where someone without understanding, without authority, would attempt to exercise power they didn't actually possess. Vanessa didn't know any of this. She saw an employee, a position, a name that didn't appear in press releases. She never looked deeper, never asked why certain systems were structured the way they were, never questioned why decisions sometimes seemed to resolve themselves without explanation. She assumed visibility meant importance. She assumed absence meant insignificance. That assumption was about to cost her everything, because while she believed she had removed me from the company, the truth was much simpler. You can't fire the person who owns the structure you're standing on. And very soon, everyone in that building was going to remember exactly who built it. If you're surprised that I wasn't just an employee, but the one who quietly owned 72% of the company, go ahead and hit that like button. Because sometimes, the real power is the one no one ever sees coming. Upstairs, on the 20th floor, Vanessa Hale was celebrating. Not loudly, not recklessly, but confidently. The kind of confidence that comes from believing you've just made your first decisive move as a leader. She had already claimed the office fully by then. My office. The one with the glass wall overlooking the city and the long oak desk positioned just slightly off-center to catch the afternoon light. She adjusted the chair twice, testing its height, then leaned back as if she had always belonged there. A bottle of champagne sat open on the side table. Not for a company milestone, not for a closing deal, for a firing, her first, finally, she muttered, glancing at her reflection in the dark screen of her laptop. Someone willing to make hard calls. Her phone buzzed. A message from her husband. How's day one? She smiled and typed back. Already cleaning house. A small victory. In her mind, a necessary step. She crossed her legs, opened her laptop, and pulled up LinkedIn. The cursor blinked on a blank post for a moment before she started typing. Today, I made my first difficult decision as Chief Strategy Officer. Leadership is about courage, clarity, and prioritizing the long-term health of the company. She paused, reread it, then added more. Sometimes, that means making uncomfortable choices, but growth demands it. Proud of the direction we're taking, she added a few hashtags at the end. Leadership, strategy, next chapter. Her finger hovered over the post button, but she didn't press it yet. Not because she doubted it, because she wanted to time it. She leaned back again, taking a sip of champagne, letting the moment settle around her. In her mind, this was the beginning of something, a shift in culture, a demonstration that she wasn't just another placeholder executive. She believed she had established authority. What she didn't see was everything happening beneath her. While she was drafting that post, emails were already being opened across the city, board members interrupting meetings, legal teams scanning documents with growing tension, assistants marking calendars with urgent flags. None of those notifications reached her. Not directly. At first. The signs were subtle. She tried to access the executive dashboard. It loaded slower than usual. When it finally appeared, certain sections were grayed out. She frowned. Probably a system glitch. She refreshed the page. Same result. She moved on, dismissing it. Then she attempted to approve a routine expense request. Something small, symbolic, really, a way to reinforce that she was now in control. The system rejected it. Approval denied. She blinked, confused, then tried again. Same message. Her smile faded slightly. Strange, she murmured. Still, she wasn't concerned. Not yet, because people like Vanessa don't expect resistance from systems. They expect compliance. They assume the structure will adjust to them, not the other way around. She closed the window and returned to her LinkedIn post, determined not to let minor technical issues interrupt her momentum. Leadership means action, she added, almost as an afterthought. Then she sat there, staring at the words. Something felt off. The office was too quiet. No congratulatory messages, no immediate responses from senior staff, no acknowledgement from the board. Nothing, just silence. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message wasn't from her husband. It was from one of the company's lead investors. Short, direct. What's happening? Her fingers tightened slightly around the phone. She stared at the message, reading it twice, then a third time. For the first time that day, uncertainty crept in. Not panic, not yet. Just a small, unfamiliar crack in the certainty she had been carrying since morning. She glanced back at her screen, at the unfinished LinkedIn post still waiting to be published. For a moment, she considered deleting it instead. She left it there, unposted, unfinished, because something in the room had changed, and she couldn't explain why. Across the city, in offices far more insulated than Vanessa's glass corner suite, the real reaction was unfolding. It didn't start with shouting. It started with silence. One by one, sealed packets were opened. Some arrived by courier, others digitally through secured legal channels, each labeled with the same subject line that hadn't been used in years. Clause 17, C activation. At first, most of them assumed it was a formality, a routine notice, something triggered by compliance or an outdated internal procedure. Then they started reading. The first page was straightforward. A formal declaration citing a unilateral termination executed by a non-equity executive without board approval. That alone was enough to raise concern. But it was the second page that shifted everything. The clause itself, clear, precise, unforgiving. No interpretation needed. No room for negotiation. By the third page, the tone in those rooms changed. Phones were picked up. Assistants were called in. Meetings were interrupted mid-sentence. Cancel my afternoon, one board member said. Already standing. Get legal on the line. Now, another demanded. His voice lower than usual, which made it more serious. In a downtown office overlooking the river, Halcyon's general counsel, Richard Ellison, read the document twice before saying a single word. Then he leaned back slowly and exhaled. No, he said under his breath. No, no, no. He flipped to the appendix. There it was. The trigger condition, matched perfectly. The termination memo, signed, time-stamped, no board vote attached. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't debatable. It was active. Richard didn't hesitate. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he rarely used outside of emergencies. Daniel needs to come in. He said the moment the call connected, immediately, across different time zones, investors were doing the same calculations, 72%. That number appeared in every packet, not highlighted, not emphasized, just stated, as if it were common knowledge. It wasn't. Not to most of them, not in any practical sense. They knew Juliet Carter held shares, significant ones, enough to influence, enough to advise. But majority control, that realization spread slowly, like something sinking in too deep to react to instantly. Because once they understood that, everything else became clear. This wasn't a dispute. This wasn't internal politics. This was a reversion of control. Legally binding. Immediate. Irreversible, once filed. One investor in Boston closed the file halfway through and simply stared out his office window. "We're exposed," he said quietly to no one in particular, because Clause 17C didn't just affect leadership, it affected liability, fiduciary duty, regulatory oversight. If they mishandled this, if they ignored it or delayed response, it wouldn't just be a governance issue, it would become a legal one, a serious one. Back at headquarters, assistants were already moving quickly, reserving the main boardroom, adjusting schedules, notifying members who were still unaware. 3 hours. That was the window. No extensions, no excuses. Everyone had to be present, or represented. The founder still hadn't been reached. That fact alone added another layer of tension, because without him, the optics would be worse, and with him, the reality would be undeniable. Richard closed the folder and stood up, smoothing out his jacket with deliberate precision. "This is not a discussion," he said to the junior legal team now gathered around him. "This is compliance. We follow the clause exactly as written." No one argued. No one even suggested an alternative, because they all knew the same thing. When a clause like this activates, it doesn't ask for opinions. It enforces outcomes. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a simple truth began to settle in across every office, every call, every unread message still sitting in inboxes. Juliet Carter hadn't just responded to being fired. She had reset the entire company, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Daniel Hale didn't answer the first call, or the second. By the third, the irritation in his voice was already sharp before he even heard what was waiting on the other end. "I'm in the middle of something," he snapped, stepping away from the golf green he practically owned. "This better not be Daniel," Richard Ellison cut in, his tone flat, controlled. "You need to come back to headquarters. Now." A pause. Short, tight. "Why?" Another pause. Longer this time. "You need to hear this in person." That was enough. Daniel didn't finish his game, didn't say goodbye, didn't even bother hiding his frustration. He tossed the club aside and walked straight to his car. The irritation still visible in every movement. The drive back was fast. Too fast. By the time he reached Halcyon Dynamics, the building already felt different. Not chaotic, not loud, just still, like something had already happened. And everyone was waiting for it to settle. Richard was waiting in the conference room, along with the CFO and 2 members of the legal team. No one greeted him. That alone made Daniel pause. "What is this?" he demanded, stepping inside. "What's so urgent that you dragged me out?" Richard didn't let him finish. He opened the folder in front of him and began reading. Per Clause 17C of the amended shareholder agreement, any executive termination initiated by a non-equity appointee without prior board approval shall result in the immediate suspension of all interim authority. Daniel frowned. Confusion replacing irritation. "What are you talking about?" Richard continued, not looking up, and the automatic reversion of executive control to the majority shareholder pending emergency board review. Silence followed. Not the kind that invites questions, the kind that forces them. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Who triggered this?" No one answered immediately. The CFO shifted slightly in his seat, avoiding eye contact. One of the legal associates looked down at the table. Daniel's voice dropped. Slower now. "Who signed the termination?" Richard closed the folder. "Vanessa." The name hung in the air for a second too long. Daniel blinked once, then again. "That's not possible," he said, almost reflexively. "She doesn't have that authority." "No?" Richard replied evenly. "She doesn't." The words didn't register immediately. Daniel ran a hand across his face, pacing once across the room. "Then we fix it. We reverse it. Issue a correction. Notify the board. There is no reversal," Richard said. That stopped him. Completely. The clause has already been activated. The filing was completed before the termination was executed. It's time-stamped, notarized, and distributed to all board members and investors. Daniel stared at him, for the first time in years. He looked uncertain. "You're telling me," he began slowly, "that because of one decision," Richard didn't soften it. "I'm telling you that your daughter-in-law initiated an unauthorized termination as a non-equity executive." The room felt smaller now, tighter, and under Clause 17C, Richard continued, "That action immediately voids her authority and transfers control." To who, Daniel asked. Even though something in his expression suggested he already knew, Richard didn't hesitate. "Juliet Carter." There it was. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, like something heavy had just settled on them. "That's not—" He started, then stopped himself. He knew. Of course he knew. He just hadn't thought about it in years. How much, he asked quietly. Richard met his eyes. 72%. The number landed harder than anything else. Not because it was surprising, because it was real. Daniel sank into the nearest chair, his composure slipping in a way no one in that room had ever seen before. "She's still controlling interest. Yes. And this clause cannot be undone once activated." Another silence. Longer this time. Daniel stared at the table, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface. This was supposed to be a simple transition. He muttered, almost to himself. Richard didn't respond, because there was nothing to add. The reality was already clear. Daniel had given authority to someone who didn't understand its limits. And now, those limits had been enforced. Legally. Permanently. He leaned back slowly, eyes unfocused. "When is the board meeting?" he asked. "Less than 2 hours." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Not in frustration, in recognition, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one in control, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Vanessa didn't hear the conversations happening downstairs. She didn't see the legal teams moving. She didn't know Daniel had already returned to the building. What she noticed was something much smaller, her screen. She refreshed the executive dashboard again. Slower this time, watching each section load as if the delay itself might explain something. It didn't. Key panels were still grayed out. Voting metrics unavailable. Approval pathways restricted. She frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "That doesn't make any sense," she murmured. She clicked into another system. Financial approvals, a simple action, routine, the kind of task meant to reinforce control, approve. The button didn't respond. She clicked again. Nothing. A message appeared this time. Authorization pending verification. Verification. Her expression tightened. She checked her access level. It still displayed her title. Chief Strategy Officer. Full executive permissions. On paper. Nothing had changed. In reality, everything had. She reached for her phone and opened the internal messaging system. "IT," she typed quickly. "I'm experiencing access delays on executive systems. Fix immediately. No greeting, no signature, just an order." She hit send and waited. A minute passed. No response. 2 minutes. Still nothing. That was unusual. People responded to her now. Quickly. Immediately. That was how this worked. Or at least, that's how she thought it worked. Down the hall, in a quieter office filled with monitors and system logs, the IT director, Marcus Levin, read her message without reacting. He had already seen something far more important. The registry, not the version executives like to present. The real one. The one tied directly to legal authority, compliance systems, and shareholder control. And at the top of that registry, unchanged, undeniable, was a name, Juliet Carter. Primary administrator, compliance authority, digital signatory, majority shareholder. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He understood immediately. This wasn't a system error. This was a system correction. He stood up, picked up his laptop, and walked straight to legal without replying to Vanessa's message. Because this wasn't something IT could fix. It wasn't broken. Back in the office, Vanessa stood up from her desk, irritation starting to replace confusion. She tried another system, internal communications. She drafted a short message to senior leadership, effective immediately. I'll be overseeing all strategic operations. Please direct approvals through my office. She hit send. The system blocked it. Delivery failed. Her hand froze slightly above the keyboard. That shouldn't happen. Not to her. Not anymore. She checked the error message. Insufficient authorization. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. She walked to the glass wall, staring out over the city, trying to steady herself. Okay, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Just a glitch. It had to be, because the alternative didn't fit into the reality she had constructed since that morning. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Different number this time. Short. Direct. Who approved the termination? She didn't recognize the sender immediately. Then she did. One of the senior board members. Her grip tightened slightly before she could respond. Another message appeared. Call me. And then another. Now. Her heartbeat shifted. Not faster, just heavier. She turned back to her desk, eyes moving quickly across the screens, searching for something that made sense, something stable, something that confirmed she was still in control. But every system she touched told her the same thing. Not in words, in resistance, in silence, in refusal. The structure she thought she had stepped into was no longer responding to her. It was rejecting her. And for the first time since she walked into that office, the certainty she had been holding on to began to slip. Because deep down, beneath the confusion and the frustration, a realization was starting to form, very slowly, very quietly. This wasn't a glitch. It was something else entirely. The boardroom was already full when Vanessa arrived. Not the usual kind of full. No quiet conversations, no casual greetings, no one checking their phones while waiting for the meeting to begin. Just stillness. Every seat occupied, every folder opened, every pair of eyes either fixed on the table or deliberately avoiding contact. She slowed down slightly at the door. Her confidence not gone, but no longer effortless. Something in the air felt different, heavier. Good afternoon, she said, stepping inside. Her tone controlled, professional. No one responded. That was the first sign. She walked toward the head of the table, the seat she had already claimed in her mind, the position that came with authority, with control, with expectation. She reached for the chair. You can sit there. A voice interrupted calmly. Vanessa paused, hand still resting on the back of the chair. The board chair, an older man named Walter Green, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. But that seat is reserved. She blinked. Confused. Reserved? Walter nodded slightly. For the majority shareholder, the words didn't register immediately. Vanessa straightened. I'm the chief strategy officer. Walter didn't react. You were. A silence followed that stretched just long enough to make it real. Vanessa let out a small, incredulous laugh. I'm sorry. I think there's been some misunderstanding. There hasn't. Another voice said, Richard Ellison. He was seated further down the table, a thick folder in front of him. He didn't look at her when he spoke. Per Clause 17C of the shareholder agreement, your appointment has been suspended effective immediately. Vanessa's expression tightened. On what grounds? Richard finally looked up. Unauthorized termination of a corporate officer as a non-equity appointee. The room didn't move, didn't react, because they already knew. Vanessa shook her head slightly, trying to process it. That's not correct. I acted within my authority. No, Richard said evenly. You didn't. She turned to Daniel, who was seated halfway down the table. Daniel, tell them. This is ridiculous. He didn't look at her. That was the second sign. He sat still, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. For the first time, Vanessa's voice lost its edge. Daniel, nothing. The silence around her wasn't neutral anymore. It was distancing, separating. Walter cleared his throat softly. Your position has not been ratified by the board. You hold no equity. Under Clause 17C, your authority is considered void pending review. Void, she repeated, the word catching slightly. Yes, she looked around the room again, searching for support, for disagreement, for anything that suggested this was temporary. There was none. Who initiated this? She asked, her voice quieter now. No one answered immediately. Then Walter spoke. The individual you attempted to terminate. Vanessa's breath caught. For a moment. She didn't say anything, because she understood. Not everything, but enough. She's not even here, Vanessa said finally, almost as if saying it could restore some sense of control. Richard closed the folder in front of him. She doesn't need to be. The words landed harder than anything else that had been said. Because they weren't defensive. They were factual. Walter gestured lightly toward an empty seat near the end of the table. You may remain as an observer. Observer, not participant, not executive. Just present. Vanessa hesitated, then slowly. She moved to the seat, her steps quieter now, measured. She sat down, placing her hands on the table, trying to keep them steady. No one spoke to her. No one acknowledged her, because at that moment, the shift was complete. The authority she thought she had claimed that morning had been stripped away in front of everyone. Not through argument, not through confrontation, through structure, through rules she never understood. And as the meeting continued without her, one thing became painfully clear. She had never actually been in control. The room had already accepted the outcome before I arrived. You could feel it in the silence, not the tense kind from earlier. This was different, settled, inevitable, like gravity had already chosen its direction, and everyone inside that boardroom was simply adjusting to it. The door opened quietly. No announcement, no introduction. I stepped in at exactly the hour they were required to convene. Not early, not late, right on time. Every head turned, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge what they already knew. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to the head of the table. The same chair Vanessa had reached for minutes earlier. The same seat Walter had kept empty. I placed my folder down, aligned it with the edge of the table, and remained standing. No one stopped me. No one questioned it, because no one could. As majority shareholder, I said, my voice steady, carrying just enough to fill the room without force. I'm formally invoking a review of all executive decisions made within the last 48 hours. No one interrupted. They couldn't. The legal framework was already in motion. Richard gave a slight nod. Acknowledging the statement for the record, Walter leaned forward just slightly. Motion recognized. Simple words. Heavy consequences. I didn't sit. I didn't need to. Because authority isn't proven by posture. It's defined by structure. My eyes moved across the table briefly. Not searching, not judging. Just confirming. Daniel didn't meet my gaze. Vanessa did, for a moment. Just long enough to understand. Not everything, but enough. This company will undergo immediate structural review. I continued. All unauthorized actions will be audited. All interim appointments will be suspended pending validation. The language was precise, deliberate. There was no anger in it, no satisfaction, just clarity, because this wasn't personal. It never was. It was structural correction. Someone shifted in their seat. Another member began taking notes more quickly. The rhythm of the room changed, but no one resisted. They adapted, because that's what people do when they recognize real authority. I closed the folder without opening it. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Everything that needed to happen was already happening. Walter spoke again, his tone formal. The board will proceed with internal confirmation. Results will be finalized before end of day. I nodded once. That was enough. No vote needed from me, no argument, because control had already been established. I turned slightly, preparing to step away from the table, but paused for just a second. Not for effect, for closure. Moving forward, I added calmly, we operate by structure, not assumption. No one responded. They didn't need to, because for the first time in a long time, everyone in that room understood exactly what that meant. I stepped back, and just like that, the company was no longer pretending. The next morning, Halcyon Dynamics felt different. Not louder, not quieter, just honest. There were no announcements sent company-wide, no dramatic memos, no carefully crafted statements to control the narrative. Only actions. At 8:55 a.m., an email was delivered to every executive inbox. From Daniel Hale, subject transition, short, formal, final, after many years leading Halcyon Dynamics. I am stepping down effective immediately. I trust the board and shareholders to guide the company forward. No explanation, no defense, just an exit. 5 minutes later, security escorted Vanessa Hale out of the building. No confrontation, no raised voices. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She handed over her badge, her phone, and the office keycard she had barely used. The same hallway she had walked through with confidence the day before now felt longer, colder. No one stopped her. No one acknowledged her, because there was nothing left to acknowledge. Upstairs, the boardroom doors were open again, not for crisis, for work. The new executive team had already begun restructuring, not with speeches, but with audits, reviews, and corrections. Every system reevaluated, every role reassessed, every assumption tested against reality. I entered the room without ceremony. This time, I sat, not because I needed to claim the position, but because it was already mine. Let's begin. I said simply, no applause, no hesitation, just movement, because this was never about proving a point. It was about restoring order. By midday, the outdated organizational charts were gone. Access permissions realigned, decision pathways corrected. Everything that had been blurred by ego was now clear again, as it should have been from the start. Before leaving, I stopped briefly in the lobby. The receptionist looked up, slightly unsure, then offered a small nod. I returned it. Nothing more was needed, because the lesson had already been written into the structure itself. Power doesn't come from titles. It doesn't come from proximity to someone who built something. And it certainly doesn't come from being handed a position you don't understand. Power comes from ownership, from knowing the system, from building something that doesn't break when tested. And in the end, that's the only kind of power that lasts. That was my story. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated or pushed out unfairly, just like I was? I'd really like to hear your story, what happened. And how did you handle it? Share it in the comments. I'm listening. I walked away from that day with more than control. I walked away with clarity. This experience reminded me that real power is never loud, and it's never given for free. First, never trade ownership for titles. Titles can disappear overnight, but ownership stays. Second, always understand the system you're part of, because the people who know the rules are the ones who shape the outcome. Third, stay calm when others lose control. Silence and patience can be stronger than any reaction. Fourth, build quietly but intentionally. True strength is created over time, not in moments. And finally, never underestimate yourself, even when others do, because their perception doesn't define your value. That was what I learned. But what about you? Did this story leave you with a lesson of your own? I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So share them in the comments. We're building a space where every voice matters. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, like, And share it with someone who might need to hear it today. You're not just watching, you're part of this community, and that makes you valuable. Thanks for being here. See you in the next story.
Welcome to Boardroom Revenge Stories, a channel focused on workplace conflict, corporate betrayal, power struggles, and quiet justice. Our stories follow a structured workflow to deliver a consistent, immersive experience. We start by analyzing real discussions on Reddit, Facebook, Quora, and blogs. Next, we craft original scripts using AI tools like ChatGPT. We then use 11 Labs to transform text into high-quality voice and edit everything in CapCut for a smooth, cinematic finish. Thumbnails are designed with Canva, and every video is carefully reviewed before release. These stories go beyond entertainment, revealing how power truly works and how justice quietly unfolds.